Hello, and welcome to CJPME's Debrief podcast, where we discuss breaking events and issues in Canada related to human rights in Palestine and the broader Middle East. Together, we make sense of events in the region and how people in Canada can respond. Annamie Paul officially resigned as leader of Canada's Green Party last week, partly as a result of her handling of the question of Palestine-Israel within the party. Today we're going to be talking about the question of Palestinian human rights and how the Green Party has handled this over the years. How has this issue caused so much tension within the party, and could things have been handled differently these past few months? This project is a podcast of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME, and seeks to advance its mission to enable Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East. Today is Tuesday, November 16th, and we are streaming live to YouTube, and we're also available on all the major podcast platforms. My name is Tom Woodley, and I'm the president of CJPME and the podcast host for today. With me is Michael Bookert, CJPME's VP, and our podcast co-host. Good afternoon, Michael.
Good afternoon, Tom. Really excited to talk about the Green Party today, which has really been quite a roller coaster to follow over the past few months.
Absolutely. A roller coaster for the party, a roller coaster for Annamie Paul, a roller coaster for all the Green Party members across Canada. And it's really surprising given all the optimism that there was just a year ago or so when the Green Party selected a new leader in Annamie Paul.
Right. That was an important election, as Elizabeth May, the previous leader, had been leader of the party for a very long time.
Yep.
Really much was the vision of the party and the brand.
Yep.
And so it was really important for the Greens to choose someone who could to take the party in a new direction.
And there were a lot of candidates that wanted to step in and take her place, weren't there?
Yeah, there were 8 candidates who made it to the final ballot, and it was pretty close. So they had a ranked ballot system where if no one got 50%, they went to another ballot. So after 8 ballots, Annamie Paul finally won with 50%. And Dimitri Lascaris came in second place with 42%.
Right, and the fact that it went to the 8 ballots was significant because no single candidate had gotten 50% of the votes until that 8th ballot, which means it was truly a close race.
It was quite close, and which is quite interesting because a lot of different issues were able to come up in this election. It was quite a valuable discussion, I think. And one of those issues actually happened to be Palestine, where Annamie Paul and Dimitri Lascaris were on opposite sides of that issue.
Right.
So to see it so narrowly divided is actually quite interesting.
Yeah. But eventually she was chosen, of course, and it was significant. And that's some of the optimism was based on that. Some of the key things. She was a black leader of a major federal party. She was the first female leader of the Green Party. She's also the first Jewish woman to be elected leader of a federal party. So all of those things were quite significant. And Elizabeth May, in her own way, was very supportive of Annamie Paul. Elizabeth May, in theory, was sort of supposed to be neutral vis-a-vis the race, but she admitted later that she did favor Annamie Paul and was hoping that Annamie Paul would take the helm through the course of the leadership race. Now, it's important to note, you mentioned that Elizabeth May had been leader of the party for quite some time. It was actually 13 years, which is a very, very long time for a leader of a federal party. She was the only elected member of the Green Party for 8 years. She was elected in 2011 and again in 2015. Of course, again in 2019. But for those 8 years, she was the only elected member of the Greens. So quite significant. But the history of the Green Party on the question of Israel-Palestine started long before last year and long before some of these more recent incidents with Annamie Paul, didn't it? We could trace things back quite a ways, but I guess we might as well start with the 2016 resolution.
I think that was a pretty important moment for the party's position on Palestine and crystallizing things a bit. And
right.
you were involved with that a little bit as CJPME.
Yeah, CJPME, we were present. We had 2 of our staff people who were there at the convention. So we had sort of eyewitnesses, and there were actually, we were, I guess it was a 2 or 3 day convention, and we had prepared some flyers in conjunction with Independent Jewish Voices Canada to talk about the need for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in terms of to pressure Israel in economic ways. And so we were quite active, and there was a BDS resolution at that convention.
And that was sponsored by Dimitri Lascaris, was that not?
I guess he was the lead. He was the lead voice, I guess you would say, or the lead activist. But actually, there were 32 sponsors of that bill, actually. And so it was at certain points, Elizabeth May spoke of the resolution as if it were just the work of a few people or sort of outsiders that had joined the party just for that purpose. But in fact, it had 32 different sponsors, many of whom were longtime members of the Green Party. So that wasn't, it wasn't a proper characterization of the resolution and the movement to pass the resolution. Now, I guess, are you familiar with some of the things that happened leading up to and during the resolution?
I mean, I followed it in the news, but not as closely as you would have.
Yeah, there was quite a process. For many parties, there are lots of, when they approach convention, there's a process even prior to convention to determine what resolutions can actually be considered at convention. And so even prior to the convention, this resolution had actually received, I think, 52% of Greens wanted this resolution to be debated. So it was one of the most popular in terms of going into the convention in terms of something that should be debated. It went through the process at convention. It passed quite easily at each stage, and in fact, at the final stage, at the final vote, it was passed by acclamation. That so many people sort of raised their hand in support of the vote that they didn't actually count the hands. It was just clear the entire room voted in support, and I think that's a testament to the strength of the resolution, and I think some of the sort of behind the scenes working of the activists and people that support the resolution to demonstrate why it was really the right direction for the party at the time.
But how did the leadership respond to
that?
Because I remember Elizabeth May wasn't very happy with that.
No, she wasn't. At that time, I had met as an advocate with CJPME for many years. Prior to 2016, I had met with Elizabeth May on a number of occasions, and she's a nice person. She's a conscientious person. She wants a lot of good things. She's an expert on environmental issues, but I can't say that she was an expert on sort of Middle East or foreign policy, Middle East foreign policy issues. And so she was, I would say, characterized her positions tended to be a little bit wishy-washy. And so at some level, I can't say that I was surprised, particularly her sort of lukewarm reaction. I guess lukewarm is a little bit too nice. She was extremely negative towards the resolution, and after it passed, she actually threatened to resign from the party, if you may remember.
That's right, yeah.
And what they did in the end is there was actually a threat that sort of break up the party, or she would resign, and she had been the figurehead for so long. This was 2016, and so the activists behind that resolution, they met with Elizabeth May, and they worked out a system where they would propose another resolution a few months later. Now, officially, according to the bylaws of the party, any resolution passed in convention does become the policy of the party, and the leadership has to respect that. But I think out of deference to May and out of a desire to see the party be successful moving forward, they all worked together, and they passed another resolution in December, which also asked for economic pressure on Israel. And it also asked for boycotts on Israel. I actually have the resolution here in front of me.
Right. It mentions boycotts, divestment. It mentions sanctions.
Exactly.
It mentions banning settlement goods. It mentions ending cooperation with military trade in cooperation with Israel.
Exactly.
It's quite far-reaching.
Exactly.
And it mentions Palestinian refugees. It mentions all of these different issues.
Right.
In many ways, it seems stronger than the original.
It actually was. In fact, the activists that were involved, I spoke to them and said, look, we've actually come out with something that's actually stronger than the original resolution. But it seemed like Elizabeth May, the key change she wanted to remove mention of the BDS movement per se.
Right.
And so that's the way it took exactly, and very good characterization, as you say. And it passed. And what was curious is immediately after it passed, Elizabeth May tweeted to say that we have defeated BDS, the Green Party,
by adopting its main principles and tactics.
Right.
Yeah.
But in any case, so it was sort of a win for everyone, sort of, as I say in an op-ed that I wrote at the time. So that's sort of the history of that resolution, and it's sort of, I think, emblematic of some of the sort of disagreement potentially in various segments of the party.
Well, it strikes me that it doesn't set the party up for a very like stable discussion on this, in the sense that there is one message coming out of it, which is that the party opposes BDS. It opposes a Palestinian-led movement, but it endorses all of the different aspects that movement is calling for.
Yeah.
What does the party actually stand for? That seems like that would be very confusing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think after that, there was an evolution in May's position. I think really a turning point for her was when she went with the Canada-Palestine Friendship Association, Parliamentary Friendship Association. She went with, I think, close to 20 other MPs. They went to Palestine, met with Palestinian officials, toured the Palestinian villages, saw the illegal Israeli settlements, talked to Palestinians, sort of understood. And she came back, I would say, a changed woman. I don't know if you heard some of the press statements and so on that came out at the time. Were you following that at the time?
A little bit. It seems to me that she and some of the other of those who went had pretty strong things to say about the occupation. Absolutely.
And I think and they took pains to actually take a stand. There was a point where Alexandre Boulerice, representing the NDP, Mario Beaulieu, representing the Bloc Québécois, and Elizabeth May, representing the Greens, did a press conference together following this trip and made quite significant statements. Elizabeth May, during that press conference, she described what she saw as an Israeli project of colonialism and expansion, a permanent occupation with a military dictatorship that governs every waking and sleeping moment of Palestinians. So that's a very strong statement,
that's very good,
especially just a year or two after she was so wishy-washy on the whole question of putting pressure on Israel. And in fact, to the point that in our 2019 elections guide, CJPME, we actually rated the Greens as the strongest party on some of these issues, given her sort of change in attitude and her willingness to speak out much more forthrightly and much more critically of Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. So she really, there was quite sort of a change in heart, and it was good, because one of the things that I've always struggled with is when you have a party that the membership goes through great pains to pass resolutions in convention, and then the leadership just ignores it. So I sort of felt like, well, we're going towards somewhat of a convergence, that now the leader is sort of getting aligned now with the membership on that issue.
Well, that's quite a positive thing to end, I guess, May's tenure at the party. That's a positive development. Unfortunately, the subsequent events were not as positive.
No.
When she did step down after the 2019 election, the party implemented this leadership race.
Right.
And during that process, CJPME, we worked with Independent Jewish Voices to create a leadership assessment guide of the main candidates.
Exactly.
And we created a questionnaire with a number of questions that we sent to all of the different candidates, and we looked at their previous public statements and came up with an assessment of where they stand on these issues. And there was quite a range, to be honest.
Right.
A lot of them actually did quite well. They had very good statements on Israeli annexation, on all sorts of issues.
Now, did Annamie Paul, did she respond to our...
She did not.
Right.
Well, she said that she refused, actually. It's not that she ignored us. She refused to carry out the questionnaire. She said that it had problematic design elements, and so she wasn't going to look at it. It's as if she wanted a scientific survey rather than a questionnaire from advocacy organizations on where she stands.
Right. And was it 6 or 7 of the other leadership candidates did respond? So she was really the outlier in that case.
She was the outlier. I can't remember, but most of the
Right.
candidates did respond. And I should note that this leadership race was happening at a time when Israel was really on the top of the agenda.
That's
because it was happening right around the time that Israel was openly planning to annex significant portions of the West Bank.
Right.
And essentially claim them forever as part of its own body rather than as occupied territory.
Which is strictly against official Canadian policy. Every country opposed that. Even the United States opposed when it heard sort of echoes of what Israel was planning. Even the United States sort of sent the message to Netanyahu at the time, saying we do not accept this. So it really was right, as you say. Israel was at the top of the news for several weeks on that, and virtually everybody was in consensus in standing against that, including.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a few things. One, I guess the U.S. was a little tricky because Trump was in charge still, and so there was some indications that maybe they'd give a green light to certain annexations. But
their Foreign Affairs Department of State, there were people there that were sort of saying, well, this isn't really the best thing of Trump.
Yeah.
Trump is Trump. You can't really say much about Trump.
Considering Trump, it was still pretty much as unanimous as it could have been in opposition.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the campaigns we worked on with other groups was to get members of parliament to sign a pledge to oppose annexation, in which they would be asked to endorse a paragraph which would say, I call on the Canadian government to consider all reasonable diplomatic and economic options to stop annexation and prompt Israeli compliance with international law.
Right.
We were happy to see all three there were no green. Yes, all three green MPs, the entire Bloc Québécois caucus, 22 out of 24 NDP MPs, although with the exception of Jagmeet Singh, who did not sign the pledge, and I think 10 Liberal MPs as well.
Right.
So that was pretty significant that these people put their names out there, that they stood up for this issue, said that action was needed to counter this.
Right.
And it was happening at the same time as the leadership race. So we asked the candidates, would they sign this pledge to oppose annexation? A number of them did. I think there were only two. There were two that didn't. One of them was Annamie Paul.
Right.
Almost everyone has said that, yes, this is significant. And, not just that, there was a foreign policy debate in which one of the questions was explicitly, do you support sanctions on Israel in response to annexation? Most people said yes. Annamie Paul didn't answer the question, but talked about negotiation, dialogue. One of the weird things was that she said that she supported Green Party policy, but clearly she had a very different interpretation of what that meant, and seemed to have a disagreement with Dimitri about whether party policy actually was in support of sanctions.
That's right. That actually came up in the foreign policy debate.
On paper, it absolutely supports sanctions, but Annamie Paul was trying to claim that it didn't.
Right. And I think it's you pointed out there that, in terms of that MP pledge that you were mentioning, each of the three sitting Green MPs at the time, this was about a year ago, 2020, so you had Jenica Atwin, Paul Manley, and Elizabeth May, they all signed onto that pledge.
That's right.
As well as, I guess, 6 of the 8 Green leadership candidates. So really, to a large degree, a lot of the leadership was sort of in agreement that, we really need to oppose Israel's sort of threats to annex Palestinian territory. And yet Annamie Paul sort of stood apart from that.
And it was really indicative of her approach overall not to answer foreign policy questions,
right,
to not to take a position. And it led us to assess her very lowly compared to the other candidates, given that she wouldn't take a stand on these issues. She wouldn't answer questions. She's opposed to BDS. She in practice opposed to other measures like sanctions or this MP pledge, and was very dismissive of people who'd ask her questions about this. And so we thought at the time that if she won the leadership, she probably would have a somewhat hostile and dismissive attitude towards groups like CJPME and to this issue in general, and that her foreign policy wouldn't be that much different than Trudeau's Liberals.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that turned out to be exactly the case.
Right, exactly. Well, and I guess I guess you and I were both following the race closely at the time, and you also sort of felt like that there was a sense that she took the decision not to take a stance on things. That she would often, her answer to questions was, "I'm an expert. I'm very well credentialed. I will respond very professionally and authoritatively to this.
I have the sources. I know everything.
Right.
and I don't have to tell you what I think.
Right.
Which is not how the leader of a party should behave.
And not what people expect in a leadership race. They expect to hear your ideas. They expect you to sell your ideas and promote your ideas. So that was a little surprising. But even despite that, there was optimism, as we said earlier, coming out that this was a new era for the party. Now, then we fast forward to 2021 and some of the things happening there. I guess maybe, Michael, why don't you run through the context? It was sort of April, May, and we started hearing things. I know here in CJPME, actually months before that, we started hearing about evictions in Sheikh Jarrah.
Right. And Sheikh Jarrah is this neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem where these Palestinian families were going to be evicted by Israeli courts for the purpose of being replaced with settlers. And so this was something that was bubbling for a while, but it was getting really close to a decision on an appeal from the families that the judge, it was very expected that the judge was going to turn down.
Right.
Exactly, and essentially kick them out on the streets. And so there was quite a bit of there were increased protests, and in the early days of May, we actually saw a few NDP MPs start to speak out about this. And then in response to some of these protests, we saw also the Israeli military raided violently the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
They actually, soldiers went into the mosque itself and were carrying people out and so on, which was Israel's, a little bit of context, it was sort of Israel's way of sort of escalating and taking the focus away from the evictions.
Right.
And moving it elsewhere. And then there was a third step, of course, which was...
Well, that I'll talk about that in a minute.
Right.
But I guess in this first stage where there's Sheikh Jarrah, there's Al-Aqsa, we're watching videos of tear gas, stun grenades, and things into crowds of people who are unarmed. It's unbelievable images.
Yeah.
And suddenly we start to see dozens of statements from NDP Liberal MPs.
Right.
Even Mark Garneau, the Foreign Affairs Minister, put out a statement. Jagmeet Singh put out a statement.
Right.
All of that was good. That was very excellent, but the Green Party was noticeably absent.
Yeah.
And it took days later before they finally put out a statement, and that was only after the third stage happened, which is rockets started firing by Hamas out of Gaza.
Right.
And so once the rockets started, then the Green Party decided to respond, Annamie Paul putting out a statement which was weaker than anything that we had seen up to then. It called for de-escalation, but it didn't mention Sheikh Jarrah or evictions. It didn't mention Al-Aqsa. It didn't mention sort of any of the underlying issues that everyone else had been talking about.
Right.
And so it was a non-statement, frankly.
Yeah.
It was weaker than the Liberal Party statements, which did, to their credit, mention Sheikh Jarrah, talk about settlements, talk about Al-Aqsa.
Yeah. It's
So-
one of these sort of situations where sort of silence in the face of oppression or silence in the face of injustice is sort of going along with it. And so
Right.
that sort of sense, I think there was a lot of frustration among Green members, among Green MPs.
I think Elizabeth May wrote about that a bit in one of her op-eds, that Green MPs were pushing for a response from the party and finally got this. And then when this goes out and we criticize the statement for lacking substance, and then we start to see Green MPs take much bolder stances. So I think it's worth mentioning them from all three Green MPs in Parliament. Paul Manley tweeted, "Last month, Human Rights Watch called the Israeli occupation apartheid. What is happening in East Jerusalem right now is ethnic cleansing, and it's happening live on social media."
Right.
In Parliament, Elizabeth May asked Canada to speak out clearly to defend the Palestinian people and said that true peace will never be achieved if we keep ignoring that one side is the occupier, the other is the occupied.
Right.
That's fantastic.
Right, which is fantastic. And it could only come from the fact that she had actually been there.
I think so, yeah.
That's what I like about that statement. Yeah.
And then, crucially, Jenica Atwin, the third Green MP, tweeted that the Green Party statement was totally inadequate and that forced evictions must end. I stand with Palestine and condemn the unthinkable airstrikes in Gaza and apartheid.
Right.
Really good statement, breaking clearly with the Green Party's own statement.
Right. Now, at one point, Jenica Atwin, she retweeted a CJPME tweet. Was that the tweet?
Oh, well, this was a reply to our tweet criticizing...
Okay. So her tweet, the tweet that you just quoted there, was
Yes.
a reply to a tweet that we had issued.
To our comment on
the
Annamie Paul's
Green-
statement.
Green Party's
yes, so
official
this
statement.
was good. They're listening. Obviously, they're very dissatisfied, but unfortunately, this led to significant blowback.
Right.
Some people might have been following this closely. Following these statements, we saw that Annamie Paul's senior advisor, Noah Zatzman, went on Facebook and in this public post accused Green MPs, along with Jagmeet Singh, Dimitri Lascaris, other people, of promoting anti-Semitism and discrimination and vowing, and it's worth quoting this is the senior advisor to the leader of the party, "We will work to defeat you and bring in progressive climate champions who are Antifa and pro-LGBT and pro-Indigenous sovereignty and Zionists."
That last phrase just really gets me. Pro-Indigenous sovereignty and Zionist. There's a bit of a contradiction there.
Yes. So this again, senior advisor to the leader, vowing to defeat their party's own MPs,
right.
which is ridiculous. But worse than that, this could have easily gone away. I really believe if Annamie Paul had quickly stepped in and said, I don't support these statements, I don't agree with them, I support my MPs.
Or Noah Zatzman does not speak for the party, he speaks only for himself.
Exactly. And maybe put him on a leave for a week or something like that.
Yeah.
Done with silence, you have to assume that she shares his opinion.
Or she's okay just letting it sit out there
And he made similar statements repeatedly to different news outlets, and so this was ongoing for a month before she said anything. And still to this day, she hasn't really distanced herself from Zatzman's comments.
Right.
So
the federal party wasn't quite so. The federal council of the Green Party wasn't quite so charitable towards Mr. Zatzman, I guess.
No. Well, I mean, first of all, what happened a couple of weeks after this is that Green MP Jenica Atwin, a third of the caucus in Parliament, crossed the floor to join the Liberals. So that's a huge blow. And on the way out, she blamed Annamie in part for causing this. And this was confirmed by Elizabeth May and Paul Manley, who issued a statement.
Right.
Apparently, they weren't allowed to issue statements, but they did anyway, saying, unfortunately, the attack against Miss Atwin by the Green Party's chief spokesperson on May 14th created the conditions that led to this crisis. Right. So all three Green MPs, past, current, and former, saying that Annamie Paul's refusal to stand up for her own MPs was the reason that Jenica Atwin left the party.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, this put Annamie in a pretty bad light, put her leadership decisions in question.
When you lose 1/3 of your caucus, right?
And they're blaming you for it. That's that raises questions. And so the federal council of the party passed a motion to call on Annamie to repudiate Zatzman and to apologize to her MPs, and said that if she didn't do so, they would initiate a leadership review.
Right.
So it sounds like a pretty easy thing for Annamie to do to end this thing right away.
Right, because there was nothing about Zatzman that made him sort of, he wasn't reflecting party policy. He wasn't authorized. The party hadn't asked him to speak out on their behalf. No one was. He was just speaking of his own accord.
If she didn't agree with the statement, it would have been very easy to just apologize and have this whole thing dealt with. But instead,
and he was just to say as well. He was just a contractor. He wasn't even an employee of the party, right? Which was also interesting.
I think so. Yeah,
that's what Elizabeth May said. He was simply a contractor.
So it seems like a very straightforward way to end this problem right away. But instead of complying with the request and apologizing, Annamie sought a legal injunction and an arbitrator who overturned the federal council's decision. So she got out of apologizing by going to court. Right. And this triggered a whole bunch of things because there are party guidelines that say that if a member takes action against the party, their membership it's reviewed,
revoked or reviewed.
Yeah, so this created a problem because it happened to be the leader who was taking the party to court. So this triggered membership review, and the federal council basically didn't like that their democratic decision was being overturned by a court, and so they appealed. Then there's all these headlines about the party taking Annamie to court. It created this huge mess.
Right.
And I mean, there are other things, I think, conflict between the federal council and the leader that I don't think we're in a position to evaluate. I think there's a lot of things going on that clearly this Palestine was a key factor in this, in sort of setting off a train of events that led to a very awful result in the election.
Well, absolutely. Well, and of course, we didn't know in the May-June timeframe, we didn't know that there was going to be an election called in August. So you had all that brouhaha through I guess June and July, and then you had the election called in August. So it's probably fair to say that Annamie Paul's failure to respond to the crisis between Zatzman and Jenica Atwin was really a turning point for the party. And a turning point for the leadership of Annamie Paul, basically, as well.
Exactly. I don't think it was the whole problem, but it was something that set off a bigger problem.
And and gave the party all sorts of national attention,
Yeah,
which
for
the
the wrong
party
reasons.
doesn't generally
Yeah.
get, but all for the wrong reasons, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this just became a huge distraction. Not to say that Palestine was a distraction, but certainly legal battles, all of these different votes and things, that was a huge distraction when the party should have been focusing on preparing for a federal election, which was called in August.
That's right. And when you have all this infighting and this internal turmoil, it's very difficult then to sort of get people to work together and to focus on the actual the winning an election or doing well in the upcoming election.
And some of the things that I think resulted from that was that they weren't able to nominate a full slate of candidates in the election.
Right.
I think they were down almost 100 candidates,
Yeah.
which probably is a contributor to why they got a third of the vote that they got last time,
right,
at 2.3% of the popular vote, compared to over 6% in 2019, which turned out to be a bit of a high point.
Right. Which is I mean, I think it's better. It's important, as you point out, that it is if in many ridings voters didn't even have the choice to actually vote for a Green candidate, there's you're not going to get votes for the Greens. So the 6.5% dropping to 2.3%, it wouldn't have been quite so dramatic if they had run a full slate of candidates.
If it was sort of proportional to how many seats they were running for, they probably would have got 2/3 of the vote rather than 1/3.
Right.
So then there's another third in an election when one of the major topics of debate was climate change and the environment. You'd think they'd be well placed, and I don't know, one can speculate maybe they lost half of their support. Half of their supporters didn't come out to vote who otherwise might have considered doing it. And it might be because they didn't see a reason to do so. I think the way that Annamie Paul handled this and the way it became a conflict with the federal council and all of that, which, whatever you think of all of that, it created a situation where people didn't feel like they wanted to vote for this party.
Yeah. Well, and as I was mentioning earlier, it put the Green Party in the news, in the national news, for all these reasons, all these sort of reasons around leadership, to the point where, Justin Trudeau, I don't know if you remember during the federal debates in September, Annamie Paul made some sort of criticism of Justin Trudeau's leadership, and he said something along the lines, well, you're certainly not in a position to sort of, question my leadership or sort of criticize
caucus
my leadership.
management,
Right, caucus management.
Which was maybe harsh and hypocritical, but also had a grain of truth to it,
Right.
because clearly she wasn't able to manage her own party. And
and it's a testament to the fact of how this was just what everyone was seeing about the Green Party.
Yes.
And all of this, of course, was triggered by her handling of this spat between Noah Zatzman and Jenica Atwin, which was, of course, triggered by Noah Zatzman. Jenica Atwin, as a sitting MP, is free to tweet whatever she wants. What I think was really surprising, the surprise element of that was that the chief of staff of Annamie Paul would speak out so brazenly against a sitting MP and basically say, well, we're going to get rid of you, which is just mind-boggling, honestly.
Yeah, every aspect of this just doesn't make any sense. I think it really a failure of leadership to be able to negotiate this. All she had to do was apologize and distance herself from those comments, and she refused to do so.
Right.
So again, if the message it was sending by staying silent was that she probably agrees with those comments, and by refusing to comment when it could have saved her a lot of headaches, suggests that maybe she did agree with those statements.
And I think for those of us that really want the best for the Palestinians and their human rights, and for all peoples and their human rights, it was sort of the final year of Annamie Paul's tenure, or basically the 1 year of Annamie Paul's tenure was disappointing, because I think from within the party there was the perception of things are getting better. Elizabeth May has come a long way. The party has come a long way. We've passed these resolutions. The party is saying things as it is, calling out Israel as, what's he call it, a military dictatorship? Is that what Elizabeth May call it? Calling for economic pressure, and then just for everything to go to get frozen over, and having the party leadership refuse to say sort of anything substantive on the issue. So I think for many Green Party members that must have been disappointing to see these backward steps or this freezing of Green Party policy around that.
Absolutely. I think for party members, you want, the policy that you vote for, you want that to be taken up and cheerleaded by your leaders.
Right.
And so it's a very disappointing situation to have, your leadership essentially ignore it completely. But the fact that Annamie Paul was unwilling to talk about these things in the leadership race, I think the cracks were already there. I think we could have seen that there would be problems eventually. And it happened to play out a little bit later,
and specifically on this issue,
yes.
which is curious. So I think we might as well leave it at that. Is there anything else we wanted to talk about?
Maybe it's just like a footnote. We should maybe mention that Jenica Atwin, the Green MP who joined the Liberals, there was a little bit of, I guess maybe optimism at the time. That at the time she said, I stand by everything I said about apartheid in Israel. She said that there are other people in the Liberal caucus who agree with me, and I'm not going to, people might find this word sort of hard to digest, but we're going to have conversations about it. Within a few days of joining the Liberals, she ended up deleting all of her statements about Palestine, putting out some other statement that was really weak and kind of seemed to, not technically, but the spirit of it seemed to walk back from her original statements. And so I think, I think she joined a party where there's a lot of party discipline, and it probably doesn't have a lot of ability to speak out, less ability than in the Green Party. She probably knew that going into it, which just suggests that she must have been treated very badly in the Greens to want to leave it for the Liberals.
Yeah. No, it says volumes about the atmosphere within the Green Party. Especially someone as committed to environmental issues as Jenica Atwin, it must have really been difficult for her to go from being one of 3 elected Green MPs to then going to Liberals. And I think within the Green Party membership, there's almost contempt, I think, for the Liberals for her. So for her to take that step, it just says an awful lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, another thing about the Greens that we should say looking forward is that in the last election, Paul Manley unfortunately lost his seat. He was a strong supporter of Palestinian rights. But the Greens did pick up a seat in Kitchener Center with Mike Morris, who during the recent election, he signed the Vote Palestine pledge to take action on a number of demands from civil society, and we were one of the partners in that campaign. So I think there are indications that maybe the party can sort of course correct and get back to focusing on its principles on human rights and avoid some of these conflicts by sticking true to what members expect of them.
Yeah. Let's hope so. That's a very good point that you make about Paul Manley not winning. He was a key supporter of Palestinian human rights within the party. His father, I guess, was on one of the boats to Gaza, one of the humanitarian boats to Gaza several years ago. So Paul has been sort of connected to the Palestine solidarity community for a long time, and so
that's the reason he wasn't allowed to be an NDP candidate in a previous
2015,
election.
I guess.
I believe so.
Yeah. So losing Paul was a big loss, and obviously you can't trace any of these things directly to what was happening in the Green Party, but certainly, with all the bad press the Green Party was getting, it certainly didn't help his re-election prospects. Of course, Elizabeth May did manage to get re-elected, but Paul Manley did not. Mike Morris is, I think, a glimmer of hope, I think, for the party overall. It is worthwhile to note, however, that he won in a riding where the Liberal Party candidate was withdrawn,
right,
and there was every expectation that the Liberal Party would have won that riding if there had actually been a Liberal candidate. Mike Morris is a strong candidate. I believe in the previous election he was the second place, right?
Yeah.
So he was a strong candidate, but until the Liberal candidate was withdrawn, there was not the expectation that he was getting one. So let's hope that he'll have 2 or 3 years to prove himself and establish himself as a representative of that community and strengthen the Green Party. And of course, more than anything, with our focus as CJPME, that he'll do as much as Paul Manley might have done in terms of upholding international law and challenging the government, the Canadian government, to do more to stick up for Palestinian human rights.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess we'll leave it at that. Hopefully the Green Party can turn the corner following Annamie Paul's departure and launch a new leadership race and a new era, and hopefully establish a new consensus on the value of human rights for all peoples everywhere, of course, including the Palestinians. And of course, when, well, I was about to say if and when, but presumably the Green Party will soon launch a new leadership race. And when they do, CJPME will be tracking it, probably doing a leadership analysis guide, and we'll track that development for our supporters. So that's our conversation for today. Thank everyone for joining us. If you liked our podcast for today, please subscribe to our channel. We're on all the major audio podcast platforms, in addition to YouTube. If you can, please leave a positive review. It helps other people find our podcast and helps them learn about the issues, of course. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please feel free to get in touch with us by email at info@cjpme.org. Thanks to all our supporters who make this podcast possible, who will help make all of our activities possible. Thanks also to Madeline Moffat, our podcast engineer and consultant. So that's it for now. We look forward to having you all with us for our next podcast. Take care, and we'll see you all again soon.